Okay, my name is Dave from Integral DC, and my presentation is on Holism and Evolution by Jan Smuts. So, what is Holism and Evolution? It was the early attempt to combine science and philosophy, and it was done by Jan Smuts. And this book has a lot of source material for Don Beck and Ken Wilber. So in Don Beck's The Crucible, he refers to Jan Smuts as an example of holistic thinking. And then Ken Wilber gets the line beauty, truth, and goodness from this work. So both of them borrow from Jan Smuts. And Jan Smuts, as I said earlier, was an example of second-tier thinking. You have a question?
I'm curious, about when did Jan live, or when did this thought come out?
So Jan Smuts was born in 1890 in South Africa. And the book was written in the 1930s, and it was done right after his work on Walt Whitman in the 1920s. So he went to Cambridge for university. And when he was at Cambridge, he worked for the English companies that were mining in Africa and South Africa. So, yeah. So who is Jan Smuts? Like I said, he was the first person to do an academic study on Walt Whitman. He was Afrikaner from South Africa. He was able to go to Cambridge for university, and after that he worked for the English companies that were mining and building up South Africa. So he was a vice president of the Rhodesian Corporation. And the Rhodesian Corporation is the one that starts the Boer War. So what happened was the Rhodesian Corporation there were some Afrikaner holdings that they needed. So they had Africans arm them and have them attack the Afrikaners. And that's what started the Boer War. So since that was done behind Jan Smuts' back, Jan Smuts defected from the company and fought with the Boers. And that was his first skirmish in Africa. So he fought with the Boers for all the years of the Boer War. After the war was over, he was able to rejoin with the English corporation. When World War I breaks out, he leads the English forces that fought in Africa. So in World War I, England had South Africa, but Germany had Namibia and the colonies above South Africa. So to secure enough resources to fight World War I, England had to take all that from Germany. And so Jan Smuts' campaign took all the German holdings in Africa. And that's how he got famous. And so after that's done, he's the leading general in the English army. And that's when he gets to propose the idea for the League of Nations. And, you know, being American, we're always taught that Woodrow Wilson did all that. It wasn't. It was Jan Smuts. Wilson was the guy who could sell it. And so Jan Smuts builds the League of Nations, but it ends up falling apart. And that's when World War II happens. So in World War II, the Afrikaners were going to join with the Germans because the Afrikaners are from Holland. And they still saw themselves as Germanic people. So Jan Smuts was the one that made sure that South Africa fought on the side of England and the Allies. And so, again, he's in charge of all these corporations, vice president. He also led the Union Party of South Africa. And so the Afrikaners at this time, after the war, became miners because only got jobs they could get. And they had these labor strikes. And Jan Smuts is the person who shot the strikers to get them to stop striking. So he turned on his own people eventually. But this work is about science and philosophy. And in this one, he's talking about the various aspects that we could put together from that. And he,
Can I ask before you go on? So I think what I'm hearing you say is that he served on a lot of different sides. It was like the side he was protecting kept shifting.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to do another one on his political philosophy eventually.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to say, how could someone who worked for corporations that implemented and supported apartheid and a lot of all these other things be considered turquoise? I don't know.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's part of the thing. So, but Jan Smuts, the other thing he did was he became an expert in South African grasses. And so he never published a scientific work in botany, but he read a lot of botany and knew a lot of botany. And so that's how he's getting the scientific background to write this work. For holism to take shape, a lot of stuff has to happen in 1930. So in the 1930s, you have Einstein, the space-time continuum, making that up, or making that theory. So prior to that, it was Newtonian thinking, so that space and time are independent, and they never change, they're constants. Well, with space-time continuum, you realize the faster you move to the speed of light, things become particleized. They shrink, actually. And then time operates differently in different parts of the world and different distances from the Earth and everything. So that was a new thing coming through. And then the Bohr model of the atom was being propagated. Now before Bohr, people thought an atom was a solid thing that was indivisible. So Bohr would determine that there are electrons and protons and nucleuses, and that electrons are spinning around a nucleus.
That was in 1927.
Yeah, 1927. And then the idea of the cell, the idea that your body is composed of small cells, and those cells have independence and autonomy of themselves, and they can act and make decisions themselves. That was a new concept also. So for you to have holism, you have to have all this scientific understanding under it. So some basic definitions. Wholes are autonomous units of unified action in the universe.
And that's W-H.
W-H-O-L-E. And so they are also schemes, frameworks that act in unison. And so the understanding of the organism in holism is, yes, there is a physical entity that is an independent organism, but that entity is also, as much as it is an action or a thing happening in space, it's also happening in time. So you have to look at the organism's past, the past of his ancestors, his future, his possible future, and the environment around him before you can make decisions and understand that organism. And that works for people just as much as it works for plants and animals. And so the field is the sum total of the reactions that this organism is causing in the universe. So all the things it has influence on are part of its field. And his goal was to understand organisms as part of a field and not as individual entities. So the basic main problems he was fighting against in the 1930s was what he called materialism mechanism, the idea that material is the basis of everything and everything can be reduced down to chemicals and physics. And the other thing he wanted to stop was spiritualism or vitalism, the idea that consciousness is everything and everything springs forth out of consciousness. So those are the two opposing views. So in the hierarchy of holism, he produces two different hierarchies. The first is, he starts with the atom, molecule, or compound in level 1, and then the plant, animal, personality, state, and then the highest level is ideals and values. Now the second hierarchy he proposes is the atom, molecule, crystal, celluloid, cell, organism, society. So he produces two different hierarchies, uses it two different places in the book. So one thing about this book that makes it difficult to read is he starts off by saying this isn't an exhaustive theory. It's just simply a rough sketch of a scheme that you can use to understand the world. So he changes his terminology throughout the book. So in one chapter he's talking about mechanism, the very next chapter he's talking about materialism, but it's the same thing. So it's a difficult read because you have to go back to make sure he's not talking about something different. So holism and evolution. So he sees evolution as having two parts. The internal creating factor, which is variation, and the external creating factor, which is natural selection. So he said the problem with most evolutionary theorists is that they're too mechanistic. So they have this idea that there's just these DNA material, and this material is passed on, and it just so happens to be better adapted to the society or the organisms or the environment. So he broke evolution down into four parts. And the first one was modification, and that's the ability for you to change your body in your lifetime. So that'd be if you start lifting weights, you get bigger muscles. And then there is variation, which is people with more adapted genes mating and producing kids that are better at that thing. So a bodybuilder spends most of his time in the gym, so he meets a female fitness instructor, and then their kids are more athletic. Then there's mutations. That would be if you have some odd gene that makes you grow a ton of muscle. And then there's natural selection, which would be the bodybuilder, because he's big and strong, has more relationship options, and theoretically would have more kids. So
could fight off predators.
And could fight off predators who try to take his woman.
Yeah.
So in evolution, he didn't think that modification would be the controlling factor, because that goes away in the next generation if the next generation chooses not to do that. He also didn't think it was natural selection, because even if you had a population where highly adapted people lived longer, the less adapted people lived for a certain amount of time too. So you always have the majority of the people in the society having a mix of both highly adaptive traits and counterproductive traits. And then he also didn't believe it was natural selection by itself, because there is evidence of babies of organisms being more adapted than the parents. So you would have every year, every generation, the weak had to be eaten off or killed. So he believed that it was variation. And his hypothesis was that a woman, when she has the womb inside of her, has control of how that baby will come out. So there's some kind of unspoken force that she has to make her kid stronger or faster or smarter or whatever she wants. Now, he admits that his theory still doesn't explain the variety and beauty in the universe. So he says there is something deeper than simply natural selection and variation happening in nature. And he's not sure exactly what that is.
He didn't know about epigenetics. So there is some memory in the cell that's not DNA that does get passed on to the next set of cells and does get passed on. He probably wasn't aware of that at the time.
Well, but the great thing about the book, he hints around that's what could be happening. And I was really impressed by that with no more information that he had, that he's stumbling onto epigenetics.
Right?
Yeah.
Pretty good, yeah.
So, holism and the mind and personality. So, the way Jan Smuts visualizes the mind, he says that it is your ability to create equilibrium out of disequilibrium. So, atoms have a mind because they can move electrons to different valences to form compounds to bring about equilibrium. So, the concept of mind actually comes from the atom moving valences. And then you'll have a molecule that does the same thing, a crystal that does the same thing, and a cell that does the same thing. But the reason that you have more complex effects at the end is because the interactions of those atoms, molecules, and cells multiplies the resultant effect. So what most people are calling spirit are just the additive effects of all these complex wholes working together. So he didn't believe there was some overarching spirit that is controlling everything or a God, but that the natural compound reactions of all these different wholes working together multiplies the effect of stimuluses. So he also says that the mind and body are codependent. They're not two different things or they're two sides of the same coin. And a lot of people in his day would say that God is the intermediary between the mind and the body. But the way Jan Smuts rebuts that is that mind and body are inseparable, and consciousness is a natural outgrowth of the body. So, that's how he visioned it. And he also proposed that instead of psychology, we study personology. So personology would be the study of a person, their biography, in the context of the historical context in which they lived. And you understand how they react, not as an independent mind, but as a product of all the different interactions happening in his environment. And studying that is more valuable than studying psychology and isolated minds.
And complex.
Yeah, and complex. So I have a couple of...
Would you say that again, please?
Okay, personology would be the study of a person within his historical context, within his family context, and understanding how he's reacting to the world around him within that context. Whereas psychology just assumes that you're just this independent mind working in a vacuum.
Okay.
So it's sort of like family systems therapy and genotypes.
Yeah, but it's deeper than that. It'd be like a biography and understanding of the history of it. But the way he understood psychology was people understanding minds in like a vacuum, and it's all like their personal decisions too. But he has a section in here where he talks about strong personalities and weak personalities, and that a person, like no matter what their circumstances, should force the best good or the best good out of them, and they should be strong enough to just handle whatever happens to them and everything like that. So he's very much an independent kind of a thinker, as far as, he'd be considered right-wing nowadays, but you should just be able to pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing. So I do have some personal criticisms of it. The definitions aren't concrete in the book, to where he defines a word and then he'll define it a little bit differently later and use a different terminology for the same thing later. And again, the hierarchies, he proposes two different hierarchies during the book. Jan Smuts wasn't a scientist. I mean, he did study botany, but he never wrote a scientific work that was published and accepted by like botanists. He was in charge of the British School of Scientists because he was so well connected in the government. But he never had a scientific treaty that was sent on its own and accepted. So, and you tell he has some very scant knowledge of some of the things he's talking about, like the theory of relativity section especially. Like you can tell he doesn't fully understand every bit of it. Like there's some things, there are holes in it that I saw, because I've read up a little bit on it. So, and it's 1930, so he might not have understood everything back then anyway. And then also he makes a lot of large pronouncements about what you call spiritualism, trying to really put down religion, because he feels like religion is beneath, elite Englishmen like himself. Needs to be rational. So he always kind of just puts down religion. But in the end, he admits he can't explain why there's so much beauty in the universe.
But he also says that there's consciousness in an atom. Yeah,
it's kind of a weird thing. So, but that's kind of integralism, right? And kind of how we do things. So, but ultimately, this was a really good first attempt in 1930s with very little information that he had at the time. So it was pretty interesting work. So you have
just like he was saying, you got to take the person in their time.
Yeah, in their historical context and the environment around them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, all the tools are there for a really integral turquoise worldview. He had all the tools there, but his life, I don't think, really reflects that, because he did a lot of really bad stuff in his life.
Well, I would think that something like the League of Nations, at least the idea of it, would lean at least yellow.
Yeah, well, the way League of Nations, but I read his book on the League of Nations, and he says in the book, well, of course Guatemala won't have as much voting rights as the USA. And he says, like, rhetorically, like, of course the reader doesn't think Guatemala deserves the same rights as the United States. And he's like, says it rhetorically almost. So he was very much a way to have colonialism without really having a colony anymore. You have to go through everything in the UN. And the League of Nations, the goal of it was to develop the developing world in the vein of the first world. So it was trying to implant those systems on the third world, whether they wanted them or not. So, I mean, it's probably high-level orange, I consider the League of Nations. High-level orange.
And he put ideals and values at the top of his hierarchy, but also just from how he lived in systems he was very involved with, if you look at the outcome or how things are playing out on the ground, I just can't see how he could be second tier. And it was the same with
when he's shooting miners.
Yeah, shooting miners, striking.
And apartheid, and
Yeah.
keep it just and also that and even Wilson, was Wilson was one who segregated the federal government, made it so African Americans couldn't, do all these things. So we, not integrated in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Wilson was horrible with
Racist.
northern segregation
Yes.
too. So you got to look at him in his historical context to some extent. But another thing about his war history, well, he always switched sides. So when he was in World War I, the Boers' allies was the Germans. So he knew where all their installations were. That was like 10 years ago. And so, of course, he's able to come and whoop everybody's butt. And then, after he whooped everybody's butt, then he's the greatest general of England, and he does all this stuff. And
Who were the Boers?
the Boers were the Afrikaner farmers. So Boer in Dutch means farmer.
Okay.
So the Afrikaners descend from Holland, but they also descend from French Huguenots, and there are some Germans that came down too.
Yes.
So, but they all spoke Dutch when they got there. And they were actually in the Cape in the 1600s. The English don't get there till the 1800s. They actually get South Africa from the Napoleonic War. So Holland sided with Napoleon in the Napoleonic War. When he lost, Holland had to give England South Africa, and that's how the English got there.
Say the name of the book again.
Holism and Evolution. It's a PDF online. So if you just type in Holism and Evolution, there's 3 or 4 PDFs you can find online. You can just download, print them off, and read it. Okay. So it's free on the internet.
And a minute ago you said that he believed that people should pull themselves up by the bootstraps.
Yeah.
Isn't that what he demonstrated in his life?
No.
Well, he's an Afrikaner. He was one of the richest families in South Africa. Yeah, so he's one of the richest families in South Africa. His father was an Afrikaner politician when Transeki and all was independent. And then when they become part of England, they formed the Union Party with Britain. So
he came from a privileged economic.
Super privileged. Like he wasn't just like an Afrikaner. He was one of the upper echelon Afrikaners.
Okay.
So he was like the guy who funded the Boer War. You know what I mean? Like he was one of those people. But I mean but the thing about it is, like, it's amazing his transformation from shooting the miners at the end. In the Boer War, he actually filled a train up with explosives and was going to run it into an English town. That's how much he hated the English. And then, like, for 3 years later, he does a complete 180 and he's like shooting miners. Like, yeah. That's why a lot of people hate him. Like, he's like one of the most, like, a lot of people love him. Like, a lot of the English descendant people love him because he's like, well, he understood what was the right thing, which is the Commonwealth, and he fought for the Commonwealth. But a lot of Afrikaners hate him because at their most vulnerable, he was the guy that shot them all. Like, he's the guy. It wasn't the English that did it. Like, it's kind of, and that's how you kind of take over people, right? You don't take them over, like, directly. You take them over with one of their people. So it's a guy they thought they could trust. And the whole time he was really working with the English, and as soon as things got out of hand, he just started shooting people.
Right. And if you look at it from probably, at least now, from the point of view of the black people who lived, the indigenous or first peoples of.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very bad.
So he's interesting. Like I said, I'm going to learn more about him, his political growth and arcs. But yeah.
And so who was it that you said considered him turquoise?
Don Beck.
So why does Don Beck consider him turquoise?
Well, he was able to put aside his personal differences to join the Commonwealth again. And then he fought for what was best for South Africa in Don's eyes because he fought for the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth was better for South Africa than independence, 100% independence. So that's why Don considers him turquoise.
But what does Don Beck say about all these other aspects about him? He says just look at it in terms of the times.
Well, he never mentioned him shooting up the miners. I had to look that up myself. So once he talked about him so great, I was like, wow, I got to look him up. So I started looking him up, and I was like, I mean...
Well, there's also the question of whether or not, if you're looking at evolution, whether turquoise even existed in 1930.
I don't,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, but he's definitely, Don considers him second tier thinking and the greatest South African thinker.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah, he was a great political thinker. That's what he went to school for, political. And then he joined the Rhodesian Company. And then the Boer War happened. So...
Thank you.
Thanks. All right.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.